everyone. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Thanks for joining me. Lovely to have you here as we continue with part 2 of the teaching, practice, and proof. And just as a quick reminder, teaching, practice, and proof relate to teaching. We hear that all the time about the sutras, about the gosho. Yes, they are teaching, but as I've told you, teaching really happens within yourself. The way that we learning is teaching. In our case, right? We're self-taught Buddhism. It's a self-driven practice. So what is practice? Practice is study of that teaching, right? Keeping it in mind, utilizing it, using it for what? For our bodhisattva practice. Our bodhisattva practice is study. See how circular things are. And it includes our chanting the daimoku and using this mandala, gohonzon, to awaken, to enliven, to invoke our pre-existing condition of Buddha-ness, because it's ongoing. Everything this life, this earth, this timeline is Buddha-ness. It's enlightenment itself. Once again, what prevents us from experiencing that Buddha-ness is the obfuscation of our human mind, our samsaric mental diversions, right? And proof is that when we do practice, when we do study and live our lives in an appropriate way, in line with our Buddha character, our Buddha-ness, our Buddha mind, we influence the others around us, and that's how we accomplish our bodhisattva practice. Whenever we do that, we experience something very critical and special that is very liberating, and that is our actual proof. And the main reason, the most inspiring reason, I should say, the most conviction and convincing reason that keeps us practicing and studying, so that we can more and more experience that Buddha-ness and hang on to it at all times while we're living in this samsaric existence. So, teaching, practice, proof. Now, as we get into this gosho a little deeper, Nichiren's going to make a lot of references to quotes in the sutra, Lotus Sutra, as well as previous sutras, and he's not going to spill them all out. He's talking to people here that are familiar with the teachings. So don't be caught out. Don't feel like you don't know what's going on. I'm going to try the best I can to fill in those references for you. But you've heard a lot of these before, so they should remind you of them. And if not, you can chase them down in the Lotus Sutra, because he's pretty specific about where they are. So this is study, right? Okay, so the question posed now, it's an interesting question, because people, and this comes up, I know for me, this question came up a lot. You get, and I don't want to be guilty of making you fetishize the words and the teachings any more than Shakyamuni himself cautioned us against that. Remember, what we're trying to get is the meaning. So I don't want to spend too much time digging all these things out and going to the sutra and pulling out the quote and reading it out for you. I'll rely on you doing that if you need to. What's important is that you get the meaning of this, right? So study is important, but our scholarship should lead to our understanding, not our mere ability to say when the Magna Carta was written and signed, right? It's more important that we understand the Spanish agreement with the Americas and so forth. At any rate. Oh, I did want to say one thing about this, because you may not be sure what's being discussed here. I'm trying to think of another subject. I use math a lot, and I'm just trying to think of a different subject that would be useful in the same way. Math lends itself so well, though. Well, why not? I'll do it again. So, in mathematics, we learn about numbers, and then we learn about fractions, and then we learn about uh, algebra, and then we learn about geometry, and then trigonometry, and so on, right? We know these various steps, and eventually, if we want to pursue higher maths, we can go into physics, or we can diverge into chemistry or biology, or calculus, and so on, right? So the point is that all of these subjects, although they evolve over time, so that's maybe not the best aspect of this analogy, but just follow along with me in a not necessarily superficial, but in a more simplistic vision of how math is taught in these steps, right? And these steps, all the way to physics, calculus, so on, have existed for hundreds of years, right? Like I said, try not to get caught up in the evolution of those subjects. Just the categories of those subjects have existed for many centuries. And so if you went to university today, and you took a maths course, and your professor knew about all these different levels of math, but proposed to you and your class, your fellow students, that that physics, chemistry, calculus stuff, it's really not necessary. It's really not necessary. In fact, it's not even useful. It's just confusing. That's not for you, for us mortals. It doesn't help us. All you really need to know, the highest you need to achieve in your mathematics is geometry. After that, you can go on your merry way, knowing that you have all the knowledge you'll ever need to know about mathematics. Now, using the mathematics analogy, you might be sitting there, you may be somebody who hated math in school, and you might say, yeah, we don't even need geometry, right? But you would be taking for granted, number one, that your life benefits from all of those higher maths, even though you may not know them intimately or use them in your daily life for yourself. You do own a cell phone. You do use microwave ovens. You do appreciate flying in an aeroplane. And believe it or not, those kinds of things, and there are many that we take for granted, would not exist were it not for mathematics beyond geometry. See, because up until geometry, all you've been taught and learned is the language of mathematics. You haven't really applied it. You mean, well, I know how to count out pennies to the dollar. I know how to add up how many cattle we have in the field. Yeah, basic arithmetic. But you can't, with that knowledge, apply it toward solving the engineering required to make an internal combustion engine, or for that matter, an electric car, or a television, right? So, yes, you'll use the language of math to do all of those things, but until you understand the much higher maths, your application will be very limited. So you won't experience the full benefit of mathematics and the way that we understand the world about us. So an analogy is going to be made to that by Nichiren here because of this question. This question makes a statement that says, in the last 500 years after, or the fifth 500-year period after my passing, things are going to change radically, and you know what this is about, right? The spreading of the Lotus Sutra and so on and so forth. So this person who's hung up on words basically says, well, it sounds like the Lotus Sutra is only suited for that 500-year period. What happens after that? Because we're told that the teaching's supposed to last 10,000 years after his passing. So what do you say to that? It's really kind of a nonsensical argument, but it's an argument based on the limitation of the language of the math instead of the application of the math. And so Nichiren's going to try to unwind this, but if you don't understand that going in, the next few pages might lose you. And it's a perfect example of how easily we can get lost in the words and not pay attention to what's the meaning. What's really going on is the teaching is in the meaning and the understanding of the idea, not the illustration or this fallible thing we call language trying to describe it. Okay? So very important to remember that always. And I know I bring it up from time to time, but always good to be reminded. Repetition legitimizes our understanding, right? So here's the question. The passages you've just quoted indicate that the propagation of the Lotus Sutra is limited to the first 500 years of the latter day of the law. No, it doesn't, but goes on. Yet the provisional Mahayana Sutra says that their practices will still be appropriate throughout the 10,000 years of the latter day of the law. How do you reply to this? All right, so the answer. The above-mentioned commentary states that such an interpretation of the last 500-year period is superficial. From a more profound viewpoint, the Lotus Sutra will spread throughout the 10,000 years of the latter day. The great teacher Tendai comments on the previously quoted sutra passage, stating, quote, "It is not only the people who lived during the Buddha's lifetime who obtained great benefits. In the last 500-year period, the wonderful and difficult to understand way will spread and benefit humankind far into the future." So that's interesting, right? So what that indicates is that if you read it a slightly different way, that that fifth 500-year period of the latter day after Shakyamuni's passing, this teaching there will be a decline in the teaching, right? So it'll have to be propagated far and wide. But the results of that propagation over 500 years will influence future practitioners of Buddhism 10,000 years. And that's really, if you read the entirety of the sutra around where this guy cherry-picked this one quote, you'll get that understanding. But that's the nature of written language, right? Or even oral language. If we seize upon one little chunk without looking at the entirety of what's being discussed, we can mislead ourselves tremendously. You can just cherry pick what you want to hear and then form a whole different argument. Of course you can, right? With anything. If you want to bake a cake and the only thing you're focused on is the flour, you're going to have one dry lump in the oven. It might even burn. You got to add the eggs. You got to add the water. You got to add the yeast, right? You can't just pick and choose the elements of a recipe and expect to be successful. So that's exactly like learning Buddhism. You have to look at its entirety. This is why, very early on, Shakyamuni told his students, you have to study broadly all of the teachings and even the non-Buddhist teachings, because all of that will lead you to a clearer picture for yourself. Your insights, your aha moments will come of that entire. I can't, even as the Buddha of the law, sit here and tell you exactly how to understand your enlightenment. Only you can do that, because your particular lenses of karma and experience are particular to you. Only you can convince yourself of an idea as being, because of proof. Proof is different for each and every one of us. And until you gain your insight, which insight's another way of saying getting it. And what is it that you're getting? That's the proof. That's your proof. Insight leads you to that proof. And that whole mechanism is Buddha wisdom. You see how all this just, it's words circling around your mind, but your experience is everything. And so we're trying with words to lead ourselves, our particular selves, to enlightenment. Enlightenment being a general term, because we all have it and we are all of it. It's like saying energy. Well, energy is, it's energy. It's everywhere all the time. But your experience of energy comes in different forms, right? Right? You're walking down the sidewalk and you're not paying attention and you run into a stop sign. It smacks you in the face. Your experience of that energy is different than the person who's just getting wind chafed by a strong wind walking right next to you, but missing the pole. They're experiencing the same energy really until it's abruptly stopped, and that energy changes in that fraction of a second. Your experience of walking down that pathway is far different. It's a loose analogy, but you understand what I'm saying. So let's go on. Does this annotation suggest anything other than the 10,000 years of the latter day of the law? The, quote, distinctions and benefits, end quote, chapter in the 6th volume of the Lotus Sutra states, in the evil age of the latter day of the law, if there is someone who can uphold this sutra, ellipsis, right? You have to look that up. Also, the peaceful practices chapter reads, quote, in the latter day of the law, if one wishes to preach this sutra, so on and so forth. All of these are statements around the lasting effects of the teaching and spreading it, bodhisattva practice. So they're all references to the longevity of this teaching. These quotations refer to the propagation of the Lotus Sutra in the 10,000 years of the latter day of the law. All the Buddha's teachings, other than the Lotus Sutra, are covered by his declaration, quote, in these 40 and more years I've not revealed the truth. Remember that. He goes on, moreover, there are some cases where the sutras have been revised according to the understanding of those who compiled them and therefore cannot be trusted. So this is something I left out of my earlier analogy. When you're talking about, again, going back to mathematics, there have been people who've postured themselves as teachers of mathematics, who've proposed some wholly divergent, well, we have terms for it today, pseudoscience, pseudomath. They come up with their own interpretations and they say, well, this is the truth. But just because they do that does not make what they do the correct study of those particular things, right? And this is what's happened with the Lotus Sutra over thousands of years. There are teachers who've seized upon some middle teaching and put their own spin on it and derived a completely outside of Buddhism method for what they say is the way to attain enlightenment. Zen is a teaching of this sort. Dogen talked a lot about teachings that came outside of Buddhism to him alone and proceeded to inculcate that into his version of Buddhism. But that doesn't make it Buddhism. That makes it Dogenism, right? So this is what Nichiren is alluding to here. He goes on to say, the scholars of the various schools remain oblivious to the fact that the Buddha sowed the seeds of enlightenment when he expounded the Lotus Sutra in the past. Yeah, we tend to forget the Lotus Sutra isn't new. It's something he taught in the latter stages of his life. They exist. They're not some future thing or something that came after. They're part of Buddhist teachings, Shakyamuni's teachings. And they pretend like it was something that was created much later and not from his teachings. But that's wrong. That's false. How foolish they are. Quite unaware of the distant past, major world system dust particle kalpas age ago, or numberless major world system dust particle kalpas ago, they abandon the wonderful teaching that is pure and perfect and sink again into the sea of sufferings of birth and death. It is pitiful beyond description that, though born in a land where the people's capacity to receive the perfect teaching is fully mature, remember we talked about maturity, they vainly fall back into the great citadel of the hell of incessant suffering. They are no different from a person who arrives at the bejeweled Kunlun Mountains only to return to his impoverished country without a single gem, or one who enters a forest of sandalwood trees, yet goes back to the shards and rubble of one's own land without ever plucking the aromatic champaka blossom. The third volume of the Lotus Sutra reads, suppose that someone coming from a land of famine should suddenly encounter a great king's feast. And the sixth volume reads, this, my land, remains safe and tranquil. ... My pure land is not destroyed. So again, he's just dropping these notes, assuming you understand and have studied these passages. It concerns who he's writing this letter to, right? They're already well read, and so it's upon us when we read these things to go and research them if we don't quite understand. They're there for us to read. So he continues. In your letter, you mentioned a difficult question put to you as to the assertion that people can partially achieve the way through their practice of the pre-Lotus Sutra teachings. In reply, you should quote the third volume of the Nirvana Sutra that reads, quote, good men, study and practice until you learn that the three treasures are one and eternal, end quote. Further, quote the third volume of the annotations on the Great Concentration and Insight, that's Tendai's commentary, that comments on this passage where it states, quote, only those who have heard the Mahayana teachings in the remote past can attain the way through practicing the Hinayana teachings, end quote. So that's a reference to, again, studying broadly. So what that's saying is that, in a way, I've not in a way, in an actual way, I've indicated this before. You've often heard me say that the Lotus Sutra stands on the shoulders of all the previous teachings. When Shakyamuni offered this sermon of the Lotus Sutra as the culminating ultimate method for quickly awakening the Buddha nature for anyone to use, no matter what their status, education, so on and so forth, he did so with the terminology and the understandings that he'd cultivated throughout the earlier teachings, bringing the capacity and and like I've said before, if you never learned mathematics and you're in school and you're in elementary school and you're 10, 11 years old, and a teacher walks in and says, okay, we're going to learn calculus today. There's a chance, but there's very little chance that anyone in the classroom will have any idea what the hell is going on. But if we learn maths step by step, numbers, addition, subtraction, division, the language of the math, and then we proceed on slowly expanding our understanding of the language of the math and algebraic expressions that cover ways of talking about things mathematically, and we slowly march forth toward calculus, then calculus has the opportunity to really be absorbed by our minds, right? So this is what he's saying, is if you've already gotten and grasped calculus, then going back and reading Hinayana teachings can offer you some depth of understanding. They can make sense in a whole new, more involved, more meaningful, more profound way, because you've already gone to calculus. You see? So this is what Tendai is saying. Only those who've heard the Mahayana teachings in the remote past can attain the way through practicing the Hinayana teachings. But if all you practice is the Hinayana teachings, you have no way. You have no way, no matter how well versed you are in geometry, to fully grasp the meaning of calculus. You just can't. You may be able to grasp quite a bit of it, but ultimately, how? How would you? Right? How would you understand the construct of the Higgs boson field, quantum mechanics, even the structure of an atom, and how molecules create themselves from your in-depth knowledge of geometry? It would be very incomplete, don't you think? So this is what this statement is saying. And he continues, those who gained the way through the practice of the various sutras expounded before the Lotus were able to do so only because of their initial practice in the remote past. The remote past being an allusion to the already extant Buddha nature. Buddhism plays little time tricks like that as illustration. Today, I don't think they work as well as they used to in those days. So don't let it confuse you. Let's go on and you'll see what I mean. Thus, you should make clear that the pre-Lotus Sutra teachings provide no benefit of enlightenment whatsoever. Then explain that the same principle holds true in the time of propagation following the Buddha's passing. All who obtained proof of enlightenment in the former and middle days of the law did so solely because of the relationship they had formed with the Lotus Sutra during the Buddha's lifetime. In other words, when the Buddha died, all of his teachings didn't go away. If you're studying Buddhism and you're practicing all of the teachings. You know the Lotus Sutra. You know how to experience your enlightenment. To then say, well, I'm only practicing this teaching, you're really fooling yourself. Because even if all you're doing is focusing on that lower teaching or earlier teaching, you already know about the Lotus Sutra. So however you're reading this step along the way, since you already know, you're only going to validate what you already know through this intermediate teaching. You see? You can't pretend that it didn't happen. Well, I suppose you can pretend, but in your mind can't do that. Only your language and rhetoric and ego can do that. But you already know Myoho Renge Kyo. Poet didn't know it. All right, let's go on. Where are we time-wise? Oh, plenty of time. Should your opponents repeatedly insist that the pre-Lotus Sutra teachings provide a path to enlightenment, cite to them the Buddha's own declaration in the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra. That should put an end to it, right? You know the declaration he's going to quote, don't you? Quote, "In these more than 40 years, I have not yet revealed the truth," end quote. I mean, he says it right in the prelude to the Lotus Sutra. Ordinary people like ourselves at the stage of hearing the name and words of the truth can expect to attain Buddhahood by relying on the teachings of the Buddha. The words of the various teachers are in themselves of no use at all. The Buddha gave strict counsel against following them with his statement in the Nirvana Sutra, quote, "Rely on the law and not upon the persons." Remind your opponents of this and repeatedly cite the passage, quote, "I have not yet revealed the truth," end quote, to refute their arguments. However, do not carelessly cite such passages as, quote, "honestly discarding expedient means, I will preach only the unsurpassed way," end quote, and, quote, "the world-honored one has long expounded his doctrines and now must reveal the truth," end quote. Rather, keep these teachings in your heart and never quote them without good reason. So that's an interesting caution, because you could inadvertently, simply because you've gotten proof in your practice, rely on these earlier, or these quotes are from, the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra as well, but they allow your in this case, your, I don't want to say opponent, but yeah, you're in a debate with somebody who's trying to tell you that your teaching, the Lotus Sutra, is a temporary measure, that it's not ultimately the teaching of enlightenment of the earlier teachings. Quote the words of Shakyamuni himself, that in the more than 40 years I've not revealed the truth, instead of relying on other statements like honestly discarding expedient means, I will teach only the unsurpassed way, because that will allow them to get a knife edge into your argument, to say, well, he's always done that, or you know what I mean. With ignorance comes a great misunderstanding of words, and although those words may have great significance to you because of your advanced understanding of the teachings, you can't rely on people who are stuck or don't want to go beyond, arrogantly maintaining their own limited point of view. You give them ammunition for their twisted misunderstanding, whereas a statement like "I've not revealed the truth" is pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot of interpretation you can twist that around with. Anyway, I'll go on. Rather, keep these teachings in your heart and never quote them without good reason. So that's an interesting statement, because once again, in Buddhism, we're reminded that our insights, our personal proofs, are our personal proofs. Others have to wind their way into their own understandings and proof in their own way. So we can't compete, in other words, with our own personal proofs. Just hang on to what you know, hang on to your proof, it's yours. Don't let it be taken away, and don't give it away, because it may not work for somebody else. Their experience is different. They have to come to that realization in their own way. This is why, as bodhisattvas, we promote the behavior of study and practice. People achieve their own proof. But you can, he says, he leaves room, he says, and never quote them without good reason. So it may be that you're communicating with your a sangha that you're a part of, and somebody in the group, while you're talking about the sutra or a particular teaching, that these things come up and they don't understand it, then you may have to work on that part of that sutra and hash it out so that they can come to their own proof. This is the bodhisattva work, right? Sometimes we have to guide our fellow Buddhists toward clarity. So it's not that you can't talk about it. He's just cautioning at what point and who. When you're in an argument is different. Debate is different than argument. Argument is different than discussion, so on and so forth, right? All right, he goes on. Another difficult question you mentioned concerns the assertion that attaining the way indicated in the pre-Lotus Sutra teachings and that of the Lotus are ultimately the same. See, they're nitpicking on verbiage here, and they're missing the point. This question arises because the Meditation Sutra says that those who rely upon it will be reborn in the Pure Land. In reply, you should say that similar assertions can be found in other sutras and cite again the teaching, quote, in these more than 40 years I've not yet revealed the truth, and others, such as the Buddha preaches so as an expedient means, merely employing provisional names and terms. And I've talked about this many times, that when the sutras make their stories, right? So they'll put up these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and all these naming conventions. They're all about certain life states, life conditions, ways of teachings, ways of learning, influences in life. They're not actual personae as much as they are personifications of ideas and situations that any of us might experience at one time or another. And again, I will repeat, those experiences will be unique to each individual. This is why Buddhism is taught in this way. It's not mysterious. It's taught to guide the greatest number of individuals as possible without limitation. So it's kind of a conundrum to teach that way, but the more we study, the more we understand the methodology, and we do, in fact, achieve our own insights. So I'll finish this paragraph, and then we'll call it part 2. He goes on. If they further contend that the Meditation Sutra and the Lotus Sutra were expounded during the same period of time, we know that they were not, you should deal with this by quoting the passage from the Teacher of the Law chapter in which the Buddha says, quote, among the sutras I have preached, now preach, and will preach, this Lotus Sutra is the most difficult to believe and the most difficult to understand, end quote. You can also quote relevant passages from the excuse me, the 3rd volume of the Profound Meaning of the Lotus Sutra, or the 3rd volume of the Annotations on the Profound Meaning of the Lotus Sutra. Be sure, however, that you consider these sutras and commentaries well, and do not quote them haphazardly. So in other words, do your own study. Make sure you understand what you're quoting before you just offer a quote from it. Always a focus on study with Nichiren. It's scholarship. It's being a good bodhisattva. Because all you can possibly accomplish by reading more, listening more, chanting more, doing your practice, more equals deeper, more profound understanding. And by actual fact, deeper, more profound proof, your experience of your own Buddhahood, right? So on that note, there it is. I'm going to mark my text here, and we'll continue in part 3. As I'm reading this gosho, I'm aware that this is kind of a specialized one. He's talking to a specific group of people here that are well-read and already have a lot of understanding. Hopefully you've had the luxury of coming to this video via the hundreds that came before it, so that you've been able to build your own understanding. But if you've just dropped in on this video and started listening to me talk about these gosho, it may feel like you've somehow walked into a classroom that's way ahead of you in the reading material, right? I'll put it that way. So please don't feel lost. This is one of those goshos where Nichiren is just, he's hashing through possible stumbling blocks in advanced Buddhist practice. So don't feel alarmed. It doesn't mean that you won't understand it. It just means that you might have to take a little more time studying the things, the little crumbs he's dropping along the way. And believe me, if you do that, you're well on your way to being an advanced Buddhist practitioner, because that's what Buddhist practice is about. Okay? Hang in there. Make your practice stronger every day. It can only become more rewarding the more you work on it. Okay? It's like a polish. The more you polish, the brighter, the more reflective, the more brilliant it becomes. Namo Myo Renge Kyo. See you in part 3.